Rightio, Money Miners, you wanted a PGM episode, and we have what we think is a PGM guru with us today. I'd reckon 33 years experience in the PGM industry in all around South Africa would define guru. Roger Baxter, thanks. Welcome to the show, mate.
G'day, Matt, and thanks for inviting us. Good to be here.
As we said, you didn't have to dress up for us, mate, but you're even wearing platinum, let alone talking about it.
Yeah, I've got the platinum link on the top here, a little PT over here. So that's 99.9% platinum proof. And I got my platinum tie on just in case.
Oh, mate. Anyone, so who you were the part of was it the Platinum Council in South Africa?
Yes, I was the founding chairman of the World Platinum Investment Council. It's obviously a council that was established by the large-scale platinum mining companies in South Africa to promote investment demand for platinum, but more importantly, to also play a role in disseminating market-related information as to what's happening in the PGM market globally. So, it's an important organization. I'm still privileged to chair it. So here we are. Yeah, but I also headed up the Minerals Council South Africa for 8.5 years. And in the Minerals Council, I also established something called a Platinum Leadership Forum, which was basically a forum made up of all the CEOs of the major platinum mining companies. In fact, nearly all the platinum companies, both big and small. And that was really interesting, helped develop a national platinum strategy for the country.
Awesome,
so,
mate.
History.
Mate, we are going to, and I suppose today we wanted to talk, and JD's going to spearhead this. He's the PGM guru in-house here, but soon to be more so. But we really want to get into the whole lay of the land and the ins and outs of between South Africa, Zimbabwe, PGM markets, some of the history and some of the exciting stuff out there. So, JD, this is where I hand over to you, Cobber. You take it away, sunshine.
The pressure's on now. So, Roger, we sort of scratched the surface initially on PGMs or PGEs, however you call it, a couple of weeks ago, and the crux behind the initial chat was the supply-demand setup. So I want to get a bit of an initial feel for how you see supply in South Africa, given your vast experience in country over there, and just the role that it plays. Obviously, it's the premier producer as a country of PGMs.
JD, thanks. So, South Africa has 87% of the world's known PGM reserves. Platinum group metals, obviously the six major PGMs, without going into all of them, the top three being platinum, palladium, and rhodium. So the country is a very large-scale producer at a global level, given the fact that it's got such an incredible reserve base. And if you just look at platinum, for example, the country produces just under 4 million ounces of platinum on an annual basis. And that's obviously dominates the global platinum supply basis. If you get into something like palladium, which is obviously also produced as a byproduct from Russia, that's quite interesting too. But also South Africa has become a much bigger producer of palladium at the same time. But if we just think of the last couple of years, we've seen pressure on South African production, bit of pressure on Russian production also because obviously of sanctions and others, although they have actually pushed a bit of their supply into the, let's define it as to some other customers in the East. But from a South African perspective, a number of factors influencing the industry and country. But if I just look at 2023, which is obviously our most recent numbers, we did see a slight improvement in production, about a 1% from South Africa, 2% increase in mine supply overall. And the reason for that was mostly because on the South African side, a couple of years of what we call load shedding. You guys don't know what that means in Australia. That's where there's no electricity available. Fortunately, they've been about a month without any form of load shedding over the last month's period. All the plans that we put in place to work with government to make sure that electricity supply was available is seeming to, having a bit of fruit at the moment. The fruit is being borne. But last year there were a few challenges, but the 1% increase in production. But at the moment, lay of the land, South African production probably 20% loss making at current prices. And with that sort of level of production, all the major companies have announced slight trimbacks in labor forces and in their production, expected production volumes, and we will see that feeding through in 2024, where you're probably going to see a little bit of a reduction, probably something of a 1 to 2% decline in South African mine supply. And at a global level, you're probably going to see something like a 3% reduction in mine supply, at the global level. That's on platinum itself, without going into the detail of all the PGMs. Otherwise, we could be here for a long time.
What's the I guess the main reason, simplified, behind platinum going down a bit, but palladium going down shitloads?
Yeah, a couple of reasons for it. I think a lot of people expected that ICEs would be phased out pretty quick, Matt. So internal combustion engines. I think the world was sold on this view that battery vehicles were, or BVs as we call them, battery electric vehicles, were going to simply rule the roost. Reality is that none of the technologies are going to dominate the solution for the cleaner energy future that we're looking at going forward. And so ICEs, for example, the slowdown in ICEs has actually been a lot slower than people thought. People thought that ICE demand would fall off a lot quicker. What's actually happened in the last couple of years is that you've actually seen ICE production resume back up to about the 80 million units per annum sort of basis, and that's been because of the COVID effect and all the chip shortages and supply challenges. I mean, even in Australia, you've seen shortages of supply of certain vehicles into the marketplace, which has had a big impact. So what's happened in 2023 is that there's actually been quite a nice increase in demand on the vehicle side for ICE demand, given that platinum and palladium are both used in catalytic converters, with rhodium also playing a critical role. But it hasn't fallen off as much as people expected. But there was a bit of extra surplus stocks that were sitting in the automotive industry as a result of the COVID years, and that's been kind of like whittled down over the last couple of years. And so we're looking at almost a set of market metrics where 2023 in platinum we had an 800,000 ounce deficit. We're anticipating about a 400,000 ounce deficit in 2024. On the palladium side, the expectation was that there wasn't going to be much of a deficit at all. And in fact, you've seen them, pricing stabilize at about $950 at the moment, if you're looking at on a US dollar per ounce basis. So in all cases, good to see the PGEs, the three major PGEs, starting a bit of a recovery from a pricing perspective.
And around the supply that's incoming, like I read the other week, that a lot of the new mines in South Africa are more palladium rich than platinum rich. Is there some merit to that?
Yeah, Matt. So what the way to look at it is that historically South Africa's mine production was from the western limb of the Bushveld complex, which is there's this big Bushveld igneous complex, the geological terms that they call it. And on the western side, the platinum to palladium ratio was about 2-to-1. What's happened over the last period is there's been a big increase in production from the eastern limb, which has more of a 1-to-1 ratio of platinum to palladium. So South Africa's overall production of palladium has picked up. But I think when you reflect on it, there's also been quite a bit of increasing level of substitution of platinum substituting for palladium, given that palladium was obviously much higher in price. And a number of automotive companies have gone in that route of basically substituting platinum into palladium cats. And when they do it for a 7 to 8 year production cycle, that'll be embedded in the platinum side. And on the palladium side, we have seen a little bit of a recovery, given the fact that the expected stockpiles seem to have diminished somewhat on surface. And secondly, when you think about the expectations about a big fall off in demand for internal combustion engine motor vehicles, that hasn't happened. As I keep on making the comment to all my colleagues, when you think about it, the clean energy future is not going to be dominated by the internal combustion engine or by battery electric vehicles or by hydrogen powertrains or by hybrids. It's going to be a combination of all of them. And just bear in mind that battery electric vehicles obviously are very, very intensive in critical minerals, and critical minerals are seriously short of supply at the moment. And that's quite good for platinum, because platinum is one of the critical minerals that's going to be used, obviously, for the clean energy future, particularly in the hydrogen space, which we can probably chat about just now.
So, Roger, you've alluded to one of the aspects that a lot of the bulls in PGM, or the few that are out there, speak to, and that's that the demand for internal combustion engine vehicles won't fall away as quickly, and the adoption of battery electric vehicles won't be as rapid as was thought a couple years ago, and that's led to some price action. But the price really hasn't moved favorably at all for any of these investors over the past couple years. So it's not really, as you sort of say, there hasn't quite been borne out, although a lot of people are sort of thinking it. When do you think that is, appreciated in the actual prices, and this realization that perhaps there will be more demand for palladium and platinum for its uses as a, autocatalytic converter? And when are we going to actually see that?
Well, JD, I think from my particular perspective, I think what's interesting about it is that the last couple of years have seen a couple of overhangs in the automotive sector. For example, they had obviously stockpiled a bit of platinum palladium on the basis that they were going to be producing, say, 80 million vehicles on an annual basis, and they weren't achieving those particular targets. Clearly, there was a massive slowdown in the supply chain, in demand, and you saw a lot of people actually also extending the life of their traditional vehicles a lot longer. I mean, it's been one of the reasons why we've seen actually quite a big fall off in the supply from a scrap recovery perspective, particularly in the automotive sector, where the number of end-of-life vehicles coming into the market for scrap recovery has been a lot lower than it's been actually for the last 5-year period that we've been looking at the data. So I think what's interesting here is that the deficits that we saw in the overall market space, to a certain extent, were being covered by obviously this surplus of stock that was sitting in the automotive sector. My view is those stocks are being diminished somewhat by the automotive sector. They don't like holding on to precious metals because precious metals, it's an expensive inventory, particularly when you've got high interest rates. But I think as we go forward, I think there's a couple of mitigating factors which will spur different levels of demand, and we can talk about the different angles of demand in a moment. But the fact is that when interest rates do start coming down at the global level, and I think everyone's anticipating towards the end of 2024, we start seeing the likelihood, probably early 2025, interest rates coming off. That means the cost of holding inventories becomes a lot less expensive. It also means that consumers out there are not going to be keeping their vehicles for as long. They're probably going to start getting back into the market to buy newer vehicles. And when that happens, obviously that supports both the ICE and the battery electric vehicle side. But I think one of the areas that we've been looking at, which is obviously quite exciting, has obviously been the hydrogen economy side, and to see how, unfortunately, when you look at the battery electric vehicle side, batteries just don't have the energy density, particularly when you start getting into medium and heavy duty related transport, where if 20 to 30% of a truck is made up of your battery from a volume perspective, that's quite a big impact that it has. And that's why hydrogen technology, particularly proton exchange membrane fuel cells, are playing an interesting role and an increasing role in a number of countries in terms of the hydrogen spurt. A quick change of scenery away from the automotive sector, just to say, one of the big drivers of particularly platinum demand over the last couple of years has actually been industrial demand. So, when you think about the use of platinum in the glass industry, so the establishment of glass production facilities, that's been quite a big area of growth, 40% year-on-year increase in platinum demand in the glass industry last year. In petroleum and others, it's always been a big player. Also in areas like biomedical and others, the chemical industry was a 13% growth rate last year. Overall demand at the industrial level is 25% higher than it has been for the last 5-year average in 2023. So there's a number of other drivers which I think are also quite important, as well as from an investment demand perspective, where you've seen investors becoming a lot more interested in platinum. Just to highlight the point, if you took all the gold that's ever been mined in the history of humankind, it's about 4.5 Olympic swimming pools full. If you take all the platinum that's been mined in the history of humankind, you're looking at about ankle deep in one Olympic-sized swimming pool, just to give you the idea of the scarcity and rarity value of it.
One Olympic-sized swimming pool fits in a GetWet bladder.
There you go.
2.5 million litres.
I know a couple companies.
He was just talking about four and a half Olympic swimming pools, which is all the gold that's been ever mined. That's 4 big GetWet bladders and one small GetWet bladder.
Unbelievable.
These GetWet bladders, Matt.hall and the team, saving mining, saving the world, and saving lives from inhaling dust. Bloody providing the friggin' best solution I've ever seen to fill up water carts, store water, get water from A to B in the absolute arsehole of anywhere.
Yeah.
And the cherry on top, they do it for you. You don't have to organise a team. You just call Matt.hall and that's it.
Mate, for everything they do in the supply, installation and the pipe work and everything, you cannot get any closer to doing it for free. Like it is, you've got to look at it like far out.
It's taking that much off your plate.
Yeah. Just consider it a tax deduction. Give GetWet a call. Get these bladders on your mine site, on your civil site, on your construction site for your camp. Just save the world. Keep the water. Don't waste it.
Matty,
Get but don't get too wet, like 29 metals.
Don't get too. Hey, but I'm sick of harping on how GetWet could save Capricorn copper.
Give yourself a free bonus. Call up GetWet.
GetWet CRE needs to tie up with GetWet, so they'll insure it, and then when it all hits the fan, they get GetWet in there as a corrective action.
Logical.
Anyway, that could be part of the getting a GetWet bladder will drop your insurance premium, because if you have them there already, lower risk. Geez, we're all over this shit.
Just clip a ticket.
Yes, a huge amount of platinum is used for industrial purposes, mostly in terms of energy efficiency, but also obviously for reducing NOx and SOx gases. And I just say to everyone out there, if you just reflect, in the last since the 1970s, according to the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States, there's been a 99% reduction in the emissions of NOx and SOx gases, nitrogen oxide and sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide emissions from vehicles, mostly driven by those two interesting elements, platinum and palladium.
It's interesting, Roger. On the supply side, we've been getting our heads in the weeds a bit in Anglo-American for pretty obvious reasons. And listening to some of the commentary out of that company, like they talk about the Amplat's business kind of delivering $7 billion of EBITDA in 2021, and then like in the latest reporting period or 2023 calendar year, like $1 billion after capex. Probably lost money. So it's so wild that you can have these periods where you have the supply shock ultimately, which is what happened with Russia, and you just have this absolute step change in the profitability of that business. How do you think of the supply dynamics, the number of players, and I guess the fragility that exists in the supply story of PGMs these days?
Well, I think what's interesting about it is my sort of take on it. Actually, was reflected quite nicely by one of the speakers at the last Platinum Day in Johannesburg a couple of weeks ago that I had the fortune of attending. Old Neil Fronman made the comment. He said, one thing that we got to do is we've got to learn to build the ark before the storm comes. And I think a lot of companies, have done that. The PGM industry as a whole in South Africa has been through a pretty challenging period over the course of the last 14 years. So let me just highlight a couple of points. I mean, in 2012, let's take it back to 2008. You had prices before the global financial crisis sitting at about $2,700 an ounce on just platinum alone. We had companies that had been building up the production base, growing supply at 5% per year. Demand was growing at 5% per year. Everything was looking quite settled, and then suddenly the global financial crisis hit. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, you'll remember those interesting names of the institutions across in the US, and the platinum price fell to less than $600 an ounce. Literally in a couple of months. It was devastating for a number of companies. So that was the first hit that the industry took. I mean, obviously they then had to go into a period of right sizing, etc. 2012, the reputation of the industry was negatively affected by the Marikana massacre that took place. Obviously, the mining companies were not specifically responsible for the massacre, but it did affect the reputation of the sector. 2014, There was a 5-month strike at the major platinum companies, which also had a big impact on the industry. So they've been through a number of different processes, different challenges over the course of the last 14, 15 years. My comment would be to make that many of the companies have not gone into increasing production on the basis of just growing their own particular portfolios. Rather, what's happened is that the companies have consolidated. You've seen companies like Impala Platinum buying Royal Bafokeng Platinum, for example. And so you've seen much more of a consolidation base taking place over the last few years. And that consolidation base has meant that the companies have been a lot more careful about bringing on brand new supply. But having said that, I mean, over the next couple of years, we are going to see a number of older generation shafts, particularly in the western limb of the Bushveld complex, probably coming to the end of their economic lives. And when that happens, the need to replace that with cheaper ounces elsewhere is going to happen. And obviously, that's where some of the smaller companies come in.
Are there competition considerations in the consolidation that you've seen in the industry, Roger, in South Africa?
Absolutely. So what happens is that every single company that goes through a merger process has to go through the Competition Commission. So it's a statutory organization, pretty much like what you have in Australia. And the companies have to go through a process and quite clearly show that it won't end up concentrating supply and unnecessarily reducing competition, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, if you take the example of Impala Platinum with Royal Bafokeng Platinum, that whole process had to go through the competition authorities to get approval. So is it going to change the game? I think for the platinum companies, their focus has been not only on making sure that they're responsible on the supply side. I think it's also that they've also been focusing on market development. Platinum is a product which has a wide range of diverse uses, as we've talked about a little bit earlier, from investment demand, from industrial purposes, from jewelry demand. And the companies have, at an annual level, been spending quite a bit of money on promoting their products through Platinum Guild International and others, to market those products in key markets. And there have been some challenges that they face, but I guess the interesting question is that some people ask is, have they done enough?
Roger, there's another interesting dynamic at play with the financial participants in the PGM market. So we understand that it's super deep into the cost curve. The profits of any of these operators have been obliterated in the last year or two. But we've also heard that their speculative short positions on the Chicago, in the commodities exchange are also at all-time highs on the short side. Can you shed a bit of color for us as to why this dynamic is playing out?
Yeah, and I think one thing that happens is that you immediately see a response from all these speculative positions when you see some of the traders having to go out and cover their shorts, short covering, which immediately a couple of weeks ago pushed the price up quite nicely of both palladium and on the platinum side. So I guess it's a question of certain of the players in that market identifying what they see as a potential opportunity and obviously selling short into the market, which obviously can end up depressing prices. It hasn't created a complete vicious spiral, which is obviously positive. We seem to have seen a degree of consolidation taking place in the demand and supply metrics of the marketplace. And so the likelihood that you're going to see, a massive escalation in shorts in the market is probably small. The likelihood that a number of the short players will have to cover their shorts will escalate depending on what the market conditions over the next period. The expectation amongst all the major platinum companies is that you'll probably see during the course of 2024 some challenges in the marketplace, but there is a view that we've reached the bottom. We're not going to get any lower than we are at the moment. And that'll be supported by the fundamentals. When you look at what's happening on the supply side, there's still quite a bit of strain on scrap recovery. Mine production is definitely under pressure. And remember that South Africa does face a couple of other potential challenges from a supply perspective. Electricity is one of them, although that seems to be stabilizing in its own right. And then you've also got some expectations of a slight decline in supply from Russia, probably a 1-2% decline in their supply base. So with those fundamentals and with a pretty good demand base, yes, we're not going to see the record demand that we saw at industrial products level for platinum last year, for example. but both in the automotive space, in the industrial demand space, in jewelry, we're expecting a slight recovery in the jewelry demand side, slight recovery in the investment demand side. With those all taking place, the expectations of any lower price than we are at the moment, I think, is probably small.
You speak to a bit of shakiness on the supply side there. And I want to dive a bit deeper into that, because we've heard from all these major companies, Amplats and Stillwater and the likes. They've been cutting back on capex, growth capex, and there are a couple of growth projects or greenfield projects around the world, but bar that, there doesn't seem to be any investment in future supply. Can you dive a bit deeper into how you see this supply side playing out over the coming 5 odd years?
Sure, Jenny. I mean, so my take on it is there are a couple of smaller players that are coming to the fore. So you've got companies like Southern Palladium, you've got companies like Ivanplats through their Platreefs deposit and others, where you have tier one projects, low cost curve, pretty close to surface related projects that will come on stream over the next 5 to 10 years. So that's some exciting new production that will come into the equation in due course. You will have a closure of some of the older generation, deeper level, more expensive shafts. Just remember, when you're dealing with shafts that are 2.5 kilometers deep, you're talking about ambient rock temperatures of 65 degrees centigrade at 2.5 kilometers. So you've got some of the biggest refrigeration and cooling plants in the world, keeping the operating conditions cool enough for work to take place in some of those deep level shafts. And bear in mind, some of these shafts have been operating for 20 to 30 years. And there's a particular time, at a particular point in time, where the economics just doesn't justify keeping them open. So what the major companies have been doing is mostly what we define as brownfields, expansions and sustaining capex. So they're not opening up brand new mines and brand new areas for mining. That's been left more to the junior space, to the Ivanplats and the Southern Palladiums of this world. And the larger players have rather focused on consolidating their existing assets. But they'll start having a look at these different things, at different options. For example, Anglo American Platinum was looking at going underground at their particular project. They put that off for a moment, given the economics of where the platinum market is at the moment. But that could come back on the table. Probably will come back on the table, 2-3 years down the road. So, is it going to lead to a tanking in supply in the global marketplace? The answer is no. Is it going to lead to supply pressures? Probably yes. But it's going to be really good for those players who are down, in the lowest tier of the cost curve.
Roger, what do these ore bodies look like when you're going down to 2.5 kilometres? And is it similar to the gold in South Africa? Is it a lot of like horizontal sheets, or what do the ore bodies look like?
Well, we in the gold side, we call them narrow tabular reefs. So they're basically, it's a tabular reef which you go in and you mine out meter and a half, using traditional drill and blast type technologies. On the platinum side, it's a little bit different. You're dealing with UG2 ore bodies and Moransky reef. They tend to be, depending on where you are on the eastern limb or the western limb, they tend to have different strata. They tend to be much more involved with a number of other different base metals. Chrome, there's a bit of gold in them. There's all the PGMs that are in them, sometimes a bit of copper. And in general, depending on the nature of the ore body, so if you're heading up towards the Platreefs deposit, they might be mining an ore body which is a couple meters thick. Whereas if you're getting into some of the other projects, you might be looking at an ore body where it's more narrow tabular also, where you're probably mining a meter with a bit of a chrome stringer overhang on it. So that's the sort of nature what we're talking about. It varies as to where you are, in the Bushveld complex.
And that's all of it? Is the way that, in contrast to say Australia, where everything's vertical or laying over and everything's flat, is that a function of the principal stress direction of South Africa compared to Australia, and hence why they can go 3 times as deep as we can in Australia?
So Matt, I mean, there's a number of different reasons that you could put in place here. So you've got basically like a saucer dish. We're mining the edges of the saucer in South Africa. It varies in terms of the angle. In some areas, it might be 3 or 4 degrees in some areas, and that's obviously to the horizontal. It might be 6 degrees, might be 8 degrees, so it depends on it. Some of the more recent mines that are being looked at, being developed are much shallower deposits, kind of like more akin to what you see in Australia. So they are developed not necessarily with the typical South African deep level shaft infrastructure where you're sinking a shaft which takes you 10 years to dig the hole to get you to 1.5 k's depth. You are seeing the closer to surface deposits, where you are looking at accessing that ore within 3 to 4 years using inclines and spirals. That's the example of the Southern Palladium scoping study that we've just produced as an example. So yeah, there's a bit of both taking place, but it depends on the scale. When you're looking at some of the closer to surface operations, some of the newer ones on the Eastern Limb are pretty big scale, looking at 150 to 300,000 ounce per year producers, and located right in prime real estate, what I call prime mining real estate. This is right in the middle of where PGM production has been taking place for the last 20, 30 years. And when you can exploit that sort of level of know-how, the processing technology is all pretty straightforward. The metallurgy is all pretty straightforward. The ore bodies are very well known. And when you look at, certainly in our case, not pushing our particular company, but if you look at our case on the Southern Palladium side, we've got 2 majors, north and south of us. They've really helped us in terms of understanding what the geology is like, and our drillings have really shown that, but it's pretty close to surface, 500 meters, which is a lot better than 2 k's depth. But if you just head a bit further south to Northams, for example, they're mining at 2 k's depth. They're doing a pretty good job. One of the best, most profitable platinum companies in South Africa at the moment.
One of the most profitable companies in the history of Geraldton is WA Waterbores.
I think I had heard that. Yeah, you're right.
It's on
James Harrington.
Wikipedia.
Yeah.
You don't just carve out a niche of water drilling and bore installations in the absolute pus ground of the Goldfields paleo channels without making some serious cash.
It's the only way really to describe the ground there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just it's mud.
Yeah.
It is absolute. And so many people have gone there and failed, and everyone's ended up with the exact same amount of water that they started with, which was 0. And until James and WA Waterbores come along, carved out the niche, and mate, when you're the best at something, you obviously make money.
Yeah.
And that is why this is the number one business in Geraldton. But geez, that's going to just look like absolute humble beginnings when they start drilling out paleo channels all around the world for water, uranium, mate. Give yourself a free bonus and get WA Waterbores on your site, drilling bores, and mate, they can drill a hole for anything.
Yeah.
Mate, they can put holes in burger rings for you if you want. They can do anything.
They've got the team that has done it before, and like, why would you look any further than that? You want the job done. You don't want to have to worry about anything.
Nah,
just
you
give
don't,
James
JD.
a WA Waterbores a call.
Hey, Matty, when I was growing up in Kalgoorlie, we had a bit of competition with Geraldton. We called him Dero Jero.
What did they call you?
Kings.
Kalgoorlie.
Thanks, James.
How do you compare I think we always ask this just to try and to relate to it. Like when you say 100,000 ounce platinum mine, what's a rough gold equivalent of that? Like based on the processing and everything, is there a bloody rule of thumb you can compare it to?
Yeah, well, listen, I do know the South African gold mining industry really well, and the South African gold mining industry has historically been this behemoth. It's been this. I mean, just remember back in the 1970s, the industry was mining, produced 1,000 tons of gold in 1 year. That was 70% of the entire Western world's production. And the companies were mining average grades of 13.71 grams per ton, just to give you the exact number. These are numbers that just stick in my brain. So that was a different time, different place. That was before the gold market was liberalized by Nixon in 1971 when he closed the gold window. But you were talking about operations there that were, easily million ounce per year producers. So if I was to give you more of a platinum equivalent, to the north of the project we're looking at is a mine called Modikwa, which is a joint venture between Anglo American and African Rainbow Minerals. They produce about 300,000 ounces per year of PGMs. That's the what we call the 6 PGMs, the 6E ounces. If you go to the south, Two Rivers is an Impala Platinum African Rainbow Minerals joint venture. They're producing about a similar equivalent, about 300,000 ounces per year. So, yeah, it's quite difficult to make the relative comparison because obviously PGMs quite a bit different from a strata perspective, from a ore body perspective. The heat stresses in a deep level platinum mine get a lot hotter, a lot quicker versus a traditional deep level South African gold mine, as an example.
So 300,000 ounce platinum PGM mine is considered a big mine?
It's considered to be a big mine, yeah.
Yeah.
It's certainly considered to be a big operation.
Oh,
yeah.
I'll run with that now, mate. No worries. Okay. I'll work backwards and forwards.
Roger, there's another sort of player that we haven't really touched on the supply side in detail, and that's recycling. And a few years ago, that was sort of fated to be a huge player in the PGM market going forward. But that has diminished pretty rapidly as the price has come off and the economics of a recycling facility has sort of fallen away a bit. How do you sort of see the future of recycling, and can you give us a bit of background on how it looks for the PGM market?
With pleasure, Jedi. I mean, I think let me just highlight a couple of points. I mean, obviously the biggest areas around recycling have been in the automotive sector. So as Europe went through its various stages of the clean air legislation, Euro Stage 1 right through to Euro Stage 6, and we've just gone through 6 now. They increased their emission standards, and they had to increase their platinum loadings and their palladium loadings, depending what vehicles that they were using, to achieve the emission standards. But as the owners of those vehicles got to the sort of end of the operating life of particularly in the passenger vehicle market, obviously those vehicles started coming back onto the market from a scrap recovery perspective. And so there was quite a big boom in scrap recovery that took place. And we're talking about a couple of million ounces if you just take, for example, 2021, in autocats alone, we had 1.6 million ounces of platinum coming back onto the market from a scrap recovery perspective. That's changed somewhat. It was just under 1.2 million ounces just below 1.5 million ounces last year, expected to fall to about 1.2 million ounces this year. And the reason for that is because on the scrap recovery side, people have just been keeping their vehicles longer because vehicles are better made today. They tend to be able to continue to perform at a reasonably good level. I think during COVID, a lot of people realized they didn't have to drive as much as they used to. And so there's a number of different things that have taken place in that particular market dynamic. And don't forget, there's also scrap recovery in jewelry. There's also scrap recovery in the industrial base, although the industrial base is very, very small compared to scrap recovery. So what's happened is I think we've seen a fall off in scrap recovery taking place, particularly for platinum, to a certain extent palladium. That is likely to not materially change in the short term, because also remember, it's a bit of an economics issue that when your PGM prices are high, your incentive for scrap recovery tends to increase. And so you'll see, the scrap companies tending to be a lot more active out there trying to source scrap vehicles so that they can actually get access to the product, to the platinum and palladium, etc. But certainly in our particular perspective, looking forward, it was a very big growth area for a number of years. That growth has certainly fallen off. COVID was a big hit. And since that particular time, you've also seen mine production, mine supply also being curtailed to a certain extent. So it's kind of like reached an equilibrium point where we're not anticipating a massive increase in scrap recovery unless you saw obviously a really big increase in prices. But that'll be one of the market dynamics you would expect. You'd also see obviously incentives for new mine supply to come on, but that supply is going to be a little bit stickier, pretty much like we anticipate scrap recovery will probably be a little bit stickier compared to what it's been in the past. just a number of different dynamics that are working in that particular market.
You've also seen, from my understanding, consolidation at the refinery level with certain companies saying they're no longer going to toll treat the product, the concentrate from other miners. And ultimately, I think the way that would play out is a higher price to incentivize people to treat the product for others. Why is it? My understanding is that there's just 3 refineries in South Africa. Why is it so concentrated? And is it hard, say if the prices do recover for a new refinery to be built, is it particularly niche and expensive?
So I think there's a number of points to make here. First one is that South Africa is at the cutting edge of both smelting and refining at a global level. I mean, all South Africa's production is effectively taken up to a 395 or 49s purity level in South Africa, and obviously there's 4 companies that are involved in it, four major companies, being Anglo American Platinum, Sibanye-Stillwater, Impala Platinum, and obviously Northam's Platinum. So there's 4 really big players in that particular marketplace. And so, yes, there are a number of different examples where junior companies do have toll refining agreements or offtake agreements with the majors, and that works pretty well. So it's well-established territory. And if one company doesn't have particular options or supply or capacity available, that capacity can obviously quite easily be sourced or looked at with the other companies, given the fact that they've all had challenges on their own production profile. So, it's not, at this particular stage in our understanding, it's not a closed door. What's important, though, is just to realize that the different ores that these particular smelters require for their own metallurgical processes is quite important. Some PGM concentrate ores tend to be more base metals intensive, tend to have a lot more chrome in them, which does create some complications in the metallurgical processes for some of the smelters, and obviously for some of the refining processes. So what the large scale companies do is they try and bring in blends of concentrate, which then suit their particular refining processes so that they can optimize them. So I just to make the comment to you, I mean, obviously there's been some inputs by some smaller companies saying that they can't get access to toll refining agreements and that they might want to set up, will work with the Saudis in terms of setting up production facilities offshore and that sort of stuff. That's all stuff that's been reported out there in the media. That may be an option that may be applicable to that particular company. But from where we're looking, we see the territory as one where there is capacity available. From the different majors, they tend to work well with the junior companies to find the reasonable offtake agreements, and so you're unlikely to see prices spiking because of refining shortages. And then last point to make is that in Zimbabwe there is a refining, smelter and refinery being developed there too. I think that's Impala Platinum operation that's likely to be developed soon. Who knows? You might see a bit of extra capacity ending up going through Zimbabwe as an example.
What portion of Supplier is Zimbabwe currently across PGMs, or however you analyze platinum or palladium specifically?
On the platinum side, they are the 3rd largest after South Africa and Russia. But just to put it in perspective,
quite a step down, right?
Quite a step down. But Zimbabwe's production has been pretty stable and growing quite nicely. It's gone up from about 450,000 ounces a year. It's now sitting at about 500,000 ounces on an annual basis. That's just a platinum, just focused on the platinum side. That compares to South Africa at about 4 million ounces, compares to Russia at about 674,000 ounces. So South Africa is the big player on the platinum side, as an example. But Zim is interesting. They do have a lot of geological prospectivity. I know a number of the companies would be quite keen to expand their production footprint in Zimbabwe in the future. But let's watch that space.
So we've spoken heaps in lithium about incentive prices and what it's going to take to get new mines online. And I'm interested to hear from you. Is there sort of consensus in the market at what level for the various metals or as a basket the sort of incentive price is to actually get a new project into gear?
Jody, it very much depends on where the project is located. So if you're looking at a typical mine on the western limb, their average basket price would be lower than the average basket price for a PGM operation on the eastern limb of the Bushveld complex, simply because the eastern limb has more palladium, as part of the production profile. So depends where the project is. I think what's been happening is that instead of using the term incentive pricing and what that incentive pricing will be, I think a lot of the new projects that are being looked at are much more focused at being tier one projects, which obviously have an impact on, who's ever on the upper end of the cost curve is obviously going to be in a bit more difficult space. And so, I think a lot of the newer projects are kind of like more tier one, tier two type projects. And those are going to be incentivized by even existing prices in terms of the value that they can create. So if you were to look at it in terms of brand new, very large scale operations, that's a different equation. It'll be quite a different conversation that compared to, for example, what some of the smaller companies are doing. But bear in mind that the smaller companies still have to raise the capital, develop the project, and take that particular project forward. And in my view, in all likelihood, with many of those smaller projects, is that those will be in some sort of partnership, whether it's at a offtake level or otherwise with some of the majors.
Roger, the power in South Africa, you mentioned it before. It's pretty well publicised. Why is it such a problem? And you said it has stabilised a bit. What is being done to stabilise it?
So, Matt, just to put in perspective, South Africa's total electricity supply is about 60 gigawatts, just about the same level or slightly smaller than Australia's total power supply. Unfortunately for South Africa's case, in the late 1990s, an energy policy white paper was negotiated, which basically looked at separating transmission, distribution, and generation into separate businesses and then allowing private competition to come into play. Unfortunately, that was never implemented, and the consequence was that there was a state-owned, state-controlled company that basically ran the electricity grid for the last, for the last 50, 60 years, however long Eskom has been around for. And over the last course of the last decade, the lack of new power stations being developed, the lack of proper maintenance, lack of proper leadership, a number of issues related to corruption, state capture, etc., in the national power utility Eskom led to a significant decline in the reliability of the electricity supply system, to the extent that over the last couple of years you saw the energy availability factor falling to as low as 55% compared to averages a decade earlier of over 80%.
Bloody hell, that's phenomenal.
So quite a significant fall off in energy availability, and obviously that had a huge impact on a number of different customers. On the mining sector side, generally the sector is a big baseload consumer of electricity, taking about 10-12% of South Africa's electricity. If you include smelters and refineries, it takes it up to over 30%. So it's a big quantum. Switching off big kit on and off is not very good for the big kit and not very good for the stability of the network. So in 2022, I actually chaired a business grouping that met with the state president. We worked with them to establish something called the National Energy Crisis Committee. And we focused on what the private sector could do, working with government to stabilize the situation. A minister of electricity, a guy called Khozientsho Ramakgopa, came into office. Really smart guy, focused on the right issues, focused on the quick wins about creating stability, reducing unplanned outages of existing power plants, putting in the right CEO into the organization to start the governance reform process. And so that's been positive to get the energy availability factor to a slightly higher level. But there's still a lot of work to be done. In the mining sector alone, we estimate that there's something like 9 gigawatts of renewable energy projects that the mining companies are basically happy to go on. And that's valued at about $10 billion US. The only difficulty is, you can build as many solar plants as you want up in the Northern Cape, which is the prime area for installing solar plant, but you just can't get the energy back on the transmission network because the transmission network is just too weak to get it back to where the electricity is demanded. So there's a big program at the moment about sorting those issues out. But it's good to have, the last month, no load shedding. That's quite a big positive from a country level investment perspective. And from the private sector side, our view is that having much greater private sector participation in generation and in the transmission network will help create the stability that we need from a long-term investment perspective. Clearly in mining, there's no ways that you can press the button on long-term investment projects unless you've got security of supply of electricity. And so it's been a really interesting learning lesson. We've had similar challenges in rail. It obviously doesn't affect to the same extent the platinum sector, although we do export, the platinum sector does export a fair amount of chrome by rail, but the rail crisis has also cost the industry and the economy hugely. Again, a state-owned parastatal versus allowing private sector participants. But again, government have listened to business, in partnership with business, have set up a similar cabinet level structure to deal with the challenges on the rail side. And what's been interesting again is in that area, we've seen a stabilization of performance, and hopefully that's the bottom of it. We'll start seeing improvements. There's a lot more that South Africa could be exporting from a manganese, chrome, coal, and obviously iron ore perspective when they get the logistics right.
It's fascinating, and it makes you sort of realize the infrastructure that needs to be in place for mining operations to really work well. I want to change continents for a moment and hear what sort of insight you've got into Norilsk and Russia. Obviously, they're a key player in this market as a byproduct, but it's a company we just don't hear too much about. Can you share any new information or what's going on, in particular in the light of the sanctions that have been put in place? We've seen just recently that metals can no longer be sold into the LME, and that's caused quite a stir in certain metals prices. What's going on, and what's the latest in Russia?
So from my perspective, from our understanding perspective, is obviously it's always been really difficult to get an absolutely 100% handle on what Norsk Nickel has been doing, over the period. They obviously produce palladium mostly, but a couple of other PGMs as byproducts, and those are now being channeled into Eastern markets. They're not into their traditional LME markets. So it's just that's the sort of basics of what we understand. There was speculation a number of years ago that they had nice big stockpiles that were sitting there. A lot of speculation about stockpiles. Those haven't really materialized to the extent that people thought. From our particular perspective, we do very much watch what they're doing from a palladium perspective into the Eastern markets and how that influences palladium demand and supply. But it hasn't been, massively material on the platinum side in our understanding. Where are they in the cost curve? Where are they in terms of any risks from to them, given the fact that nickel is their primary business, and nickel has been kind of like overrun by cheap supply from Indonesia. So that's been an interesting area to think about and look at. We're kind of like doing a bit of understanding as to what's happening there, because obviously the Indonesians have come forward. The processing technology that they're using is much more cost effective. There's obviously a lot of Chinese investment in Indonesia, which has been quite interesting too. So what implications that has ultimately for Norsk Nickel and others, we don't know at this stage. We're just trying to understand the dynamic. Yeah.
Bloody beautiful. You got anything else, boys? Jesus Christ, we're all gurus now, Rog. I'll look forward to listening back to that.
Absolutely.
Bloody anything interesting that we haven't asked, probably?
Yeah, I think maybe just one last thing to make a comment about is that when you look at these metals, I mean, they clearly are noble, they're precious, they have very similar chemical properties. But I think just when you put them all in perspective, they have an incredibly important role. We talked a little bit earlier about the fact that there's been a 99% reduction since the 1970s in the amount of NOx and SOx gases coming out of your typical ICE motor, both at a sedan level as well as at a ute level. In a place like the United States, we estimate that 600 cars today produce as much emissions as one car from the 70s. So it just gives you a perspective on how platinum group metals have helped change the world positively. I have a very strong view, and it's not just because I'm in the platinum industry, but I have a very strong view that these noble metals will play a critically important role in our clean energy future, not only in terms of continuing to reduce the NOx and SOx and other and particulate filters out of diesel cats and petrol-driven motors in the ICE framework, but also will play an incredibly important role in the emerging hydrogen economy. And just to make the comment on the hydrogen economy side, as I was mentioning a little bit earlier, when you think about the energy density in a lithium battery, yeah, you can put in a Tesla, you can put it into smaller vehicles, you can get a range of 500 to 1,000 Ks. Try doing that in a delivery truck, which is carrying a couple of tons of weight. Try and do that in a ship or in a train. And so I think it's been interesting to us to see the work, the progress that is being made in the proton exchange membrane fuel cell technology side. And obviously platinum is intricately linked to the whole process, as you know, and maybe that's a subject for another day where we could talk about the mitochondria, the platinum membrane, which basically converts the electrons out of the hydrogen into electricity and provides a bit of industrial quality carbon dioxide and water that you can drink, which you just reprocess into the circuit. You're talking about energy efficiency of about 60%. And so it's been interesting to see the evolution of how fuel cell technologies are being incorporated with battery technologies in hybrid vehicles. And you can see the automotive industry is very much keen to find a multiplicity of different solutions, because not one solution is going to solve our clean energy future. And so from my view, I think hydrogen has a key role to play, and linked to hydrogen is very much platinum group metals, driven mostly by the big three: platinum, palladium, and rhodium. I think that's an area which in its own right is going to create a lot of scope for PGMs going forward. I'm just looking forward to seeing that first hydrogen filling station in Perth, and hopefully one in hopefully a couple across here, and we'll demonstrate the technology really works. It's one of those areas which will give us some interesting optionality for our clean energy future.
Very
Love
good,
it.
mate. Learned a shitload out of that. So
Thanks for your time, Roger. Appreciate it.
Really appreciate it.
Gents, thanks very much. Really appreciate you inviting me on. Hope to get an invite again in the future.
For sure, mate.
Cheers, Roger. Thank you.
Well, there we go. There's the bloody the PGM 101. Now that we know that, JD, we can then. It was like after the Mike Olkin chat, probably after the Justin Hoon one. It was our intro to it.
Yeah.
Now we're going to get digging, and we're going to start taking PGMs.
We've got another one up our
next level
sleeve
on the show.
We've got another good one up our sleeve on the area of PGM. Bit of a different view, so we're starting to get a lay of the land, and it's a good time to do it when the commodities are just almost entirely just beaten up, smashed right into the cost curve. So it's the first little taste for it, Matty.
It's the same, the Bushveld. It sounds the same as Cambalda. They say West is best.
People from WA say that too.
They do. Oh, dear. Yeah, WA people can be a bit delusional sometimes. Take that from a New South Wales person.
You're adopted here, mate.
So can the people from Cambalda, mate.
Oh, right. Too easy. Thanks to all the bloody partners. As always do. We have James, the Geraldton bloody Chamber of Commerce Business Person of the Year, James Harrington, WA Waterboards. Who else do we have in there? GetWet.
GetWet. Look no further.
GetWet.
Also,
VRIFY. No need to say more there. DSI Underground, Silverstone, CRE Insurance, Brooks Airways,
and K-Drill. Hoodaroo, mate, miners.
The information contained in this episode of Money of Mine is of general nature only and does not take into account the objectives, financial situation or needs of any particular person. Before making any investment decision, you should consult with your financial advisor and consider how appropriate the advice is to your objectives, financial situation and needs.